Welcome to Double Helix History. I'm Jerome de Groot.
And I'm Matthew Stallard.
And over the next couple of podcasts, we're going to be exploring all kinds of interesting topics around the idea of DNA and the past.
So, Jerome, you started this project about 6 months, a year ago. What was the motivation behind that?
Well, I'm really interested in how people get their past, how people understand themselves and in relation to the past. And so I got quite interested in family history about 5 years ago. But obviously over the last 2 years, I mean a little bit longer, but over the last 2 years, very spectacularly, genetics are being used in family history investigation hugely now by nearly everyone that does any kind of family history, and indeed millions of people who haven't even got much interest in family history being persuaded to do some kind of DNA test to find out about their past, their ethnicity, their background. So I became very interested in this because it seems to me that we understand ourselves through the past in particular ways, and this is a new way of doing it.
And what's the particular sort of method of research that you've chosen, and why did you choose that?
The research that we're going to be sharing with you over the next couple of podcasts is based on a set of interviews and focus groups that we've been undertaking in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and in Australia over the past 12 months or thereabouts. And the reason for undertaking research in this way was that we wanted to talk to a sort of relatively solid group of people. We've talked to about 70 or 80 people over the last 12 months. And we wanted to talk to family historians particularly because it was my understanding that family historians have a very clear sense of what they do when they approach the past. They're very, very smart in terms of thinking about evidence, in terms of thinking about organisation of source. They have a very firm methodology, and they're often very well skilled. They've often spent a lot of time, decades even, working in this area. They've often gone on lots of courses. They share knowledge with one another. But very few of them are actually geneticists, and very few of them have a kind of working knowledge of DNA in any real sense. So I was fascinated by what would happen when you had this group of people who had a scholarly apparatus, who had a kind of set of ideas of how they might approach the past. I was fascinated by seeing how the impact of genetic testing would change, if it did change, the way that they might approach their past.
But if it hadn't been for the DNA, it would never have occurred to me that you could find people who you knew that you must be. You knew with this common ancestry. I've gone back to sort of a 10th great grandparents on one side, but I would never have dreamt that I could ever find anybody descended from them. And now I know that I can. It's hard work, and you can only do it if they've done a lot, but it can be good fun and it keeps you busy.
I didn't know. I obviously didn't
know what to do.
I didn't look into it sufficiently in advance to think, well, what's it going to tell me?
And I think a lot of people get ancestry tests or whatever because they think that's going to give them their family tree.
Yeah.
They don't realise that all it is another tool. Unless you've actually done some genealogical work and built up the basis of a tree, it's going to be nothing to you because you have nothing to compare your matches to.
Unfortunately, that's the way Ancestry sell it, though, don't
yes,
they?
exactly.
They sell it, look at these discoveries popping up and things like that. My husband insisted on having his Ancestry done right, and I started to prepare him an Ancestry tray, and then he went afterwards, I really only want to know whether I was Celtic or Norman.
That's the least reliable bit of information we're going to get anyway.
I got to test only 6 months ago, and I just wanted to track the Irish that have gone to America and the family name, and I'm not too enthusiastic about it. It's quite good, but I haven't found anything particularly. But I'm interested, like some of the others, in medical history, and I'm quite interested when you can find out. But the samples I got from my family, I got a group done, and I'll just await and watch. But there's a genetic disease in our family that I'd like to track.
That's interesting. Others? What are your thoughts?
I got mine as a gift from my daughter for Mother's Day. She was hoping I wasn't really her mother. Tragically, I am.
She has to have been tested then.
Yes. It was
Has
a
she?
joke, Claire.
Oh, wait. I thought did she do hers as well? No. Okay.
And I was extraordinarily sceptical, and I would never have bought the test because I get enraged by those ancestry ads. And I was very surprised to discover that it was able to correctly identify my first, second and third cousins, ones that I had known anyway and had been tested, so I was really shocked about that.
How accurate it was.
Sorry?
How accurate it was.
Yes, I was. Yeah, I was genuinely surprised about that. I just thought it was a load of nonsense. And also at the forum last year, we'd been sort of told that if you get up to third cousins, anything beyond is just noise, genetically noise, so you cannot find anyone beyond third cousins, and that's not true. But for me, the big thrill was a particular family that I've been looking for 40 years, just complete mystery, and I'd had a lot of circumstantial evidence that, this guy was the son of this family, but no proof. And I was able to match with the descendants of, this person's, his sister's children, and 3 people descended from his uncle. So I've got a family tree back to 1219 on that branch, which is really very exciting.
Yeah.
I'm envious. Yeah, me too. No, but for me it was about the fact that I've been looking for 40 years for this fellow and could not have done it without the DNA.
So, tell us a bit more about the DNA.
I don't know anything about DNA. I really don't. I really barely spell it. But what I'm interested in is really what people make of it. I'm not. Well, I am obviously interested in whether it's rightly done or whether the sequencing is smart and thoughtful. I'm interested in all these things, but my interest has been in what people make of this rather than necessarily what it actually is. And you might suggest that that's actually the case anyway, because DNA only means, in comparison to other DNA, and it's only read in certain ways. So it's all relatively subjective, what it means. That's not a scientific view, but what I mean is what it means to an individual, how it changes what they think about themselves, how it might change what they think about the past. All these things are very much a subjective thing, I'd say. DNA. Well, in 1953, it was first described by Crick and Watson in their famous paper. And since then, it has entered the popular imagination, I'd say. And I would argue that it's probably the most well-known scientific thing, not that it's a scientific thing, but it's well-known part of scientific discourse in the West, at least. I think if you grabbed nearly anyone, they would know what DNA largely was, but push them any further and they'd probably say one of two things. They'd say double helix, and they'd say building blocks of life. And for that reason, I'm kind of quite convinced that DNA has become super iconic. It's so difficult to understand that it's become just a thing that no one really does much about. They do it at school and that's it, they move on. So we're all quite comfortable, we know what DNA is, but actually push anyone, and I don't think anyone really knows, at a kind of lay level. That's maybe a bit unfair, but it just feels like, there's this it's this icon, everyone knows what it looks like, what it is, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but ask people to describe a little bit more what a double helix is, and that starts to fall apart. What it actually, what is DNA, how does it work, all these kinds of things. So it's quite fascinating for that. So it's in everyone's mind, everyone knows this thing exists, but so for that reason it's really fascinating, because when you get people doing genetic genealogy, they're entering into something which they think they understand, possibly. The most famous version of DNA tests is paternity tests, of course. So everyone sort of seems to know that there's something which proves something. There's a truth claim in DNA testing. So they enter into this thing kind of quite willingly because there's a confidence. And then when the information comes back, I'm not completely sure, A, anyone knows what to do with it, and B, anyone is expecting what's coming back. When we were in Australia, we met loads of people who'd had sort of revelation and found all kinds of things out, or discovered things they didn't necessarily want to find out. And this is from a group of people who are quite smart about this. The family historians are already, aware that there's probably going to be some kinds of things in their past that they're not necessarily aware of and might wish to be a bit careful of. And so this community themselves are finding things out they weren't anticipating, and you just think that's amazing.
And how much of the science do you kind of understand? Are you comfortable that you understand?
Well, yes, that's
So there's a category here of you trust it to a certain extent, but I'm not. Obviously that's how we work with most science, most medical science. But yeah, I'd be interested in that kind of disjunct.
Do we trust it though, or do we just use it to put us into a place where we can do our normal research?
I think it's more accurate than trusting a BDM certificate.
Yes. But it doesn't tell you who the relative is.
No, it doesn't tell you as much, but it is more accurate.
Yeah.
So you need a traditional way.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you need to drive a car, but I don't know how it works.
Oh yeah. Anyone know how planes
Just knowing
go?
doesn't help you.
No.
The just knowing doesn't help. So you can trust the just knowing, but you still need to do the research to find the. So it's you don't trust it in as much as you're definitely my cousin, and then that's the end of it.
It's just a tool for parentage.
And then
it's got nothing to do with social history. It's just pedigree.
But I'm not interested in the science necessarily. I mean, I know you guys have got a science background and love all that stuff.
But I mean, I'm talking about the science. I'm not talking about the.
I know you are, but I'm adding a new point. I think I agree with you that technology and genealogy is working hand in hand to improve all that. I was just going to say that I don't actually think you need to know anything about the science. I like the problem solving side of it, and we've talked about that a bit before, but not coming from the science.
But I think a computer, using a computer to do some analysis, in effect, is a variation of science.
Oh, you think so? Okay, well, I wouldn't be thinking that.
It's a tool. It's very far away from history in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah.
Although actually, a lot of the story is about doing data mining and network analysis.
DNA is nothing like the history stuff.
I don't think it's very far away from history at all. I think history's always been about analysing data and looking for patterns.
Processes.
History is a science, it's just a different type of science. It's a science in the humanities.
I see DNA as a tool, not as a separate endeavour. I mean, I see it as a tool to help me get what I want to know. And that has a historical context. And because otherwise, what am I doing anyway? Why am I doing it? And I just see it as another way. I mean, I could go and learn to read German handwriting and spend my time in German parish register offices, and because I can't read the German handwriting, but it's a different skill that I don't have. But I find the DNA is a tool to help me bridge a gap that I didn't have.
And I guess that's why the technology, we embrace the technology, is another tool that's going to help us get further and find more data.
Being naturally skeptical, I think, is helpful because it's always I'm more of a prove it kind of person. So I'm not the ones that are so frustrating are the gullible people who trace themselves to anybody they find.
Charlemagne or the Romanovs. That's the two.
Right. Really, Attila the Hun, whatever. But crazy stuff, and it's like I don't believe anything until I've proven it 3 different. I just don't. It's no fun to imagine what it must be like if it's false. And I'm more interested in what's really the truth opposed to any kind of fiction. I'm not interested in that. And that's what's nice about DNA, because scientific proof is even better.
More about DNA though. So DNA, essentially, DNA bubbled along as a family history technology, not doing very much. It was very famously used in several cases, including the work around Thomas Jefferson's relationship with his slave Sally Hemings, and that was quite high profile in the late 90s and early 21st century, but very expensive to do that kind of work. When Steve Jobs had his whole genome sequenced, it took a long time and cost him $1 million or something like that. So there's been this kind of ability to do certain things with DNA for years. What has changed is the the cost of the work on genetic material has come down substantially, and that means that you can, as a company, offer, an actual a kind of a product which is available for and is achievable. So some family historians did do earlier versions of the tests, not the different types of test. They were quite expensive, and I don't think, because they tended to be what's the word I'm looking for? Because older versions of the tests offered different types of material for in terms of the results. It meant that it wasn't as useful for family historians, really. It was more results to do with your relationship with the species rather than with your family. So it wasn't didn't have much kind of sort of structure for family historians, whereas now the types of tests that can be done and also the speed of them and the cost means that they're much more useful.
So we've had a nice introduction there to family history, genetic genealogy, but maybe it'd be helpful to learn a bit more depth how exactly that works, how you actually do genealogy with genetics.
Well, probably best to ask an expert. We spoke with Debbie Kennett, who's a world-famous genetic genealogist. She came up to Manchester to do a talk at the Irish World Heritage Centre, and we've got a little recording of that right now, and then a discussion with Debbie about what she sees as the most important aspects of genetic genealogy at the moment.
Keeps doubling in every generation. So if you go back 1,000 years, we all have approximately 1 billion ancestors, but obviously they're not all separate ancestors. A lot of our ancestors are actually doubled up in our family tree, so we will all have family trees that look something like that if we could trace every single ancestor. So when you are thinking about, say, taking a DNA test and wanting to find out who you are, it's a question of which ancestors you are trying to find out about. Is it your grandparents? Is it all these ancestors from 1,000 years ago? Now, the companies themselves will tell you that if you take a DNA test, you'll be able to find out who you are, where you're from. These are just some examples from the various company websites there. But I'm afraid a DNA test cannot tell you these things on its own. And how can a DNA test possibly capture the complexity of just my own very simple, basic, boring family tree with my English ancestry? And how can it capture all those other ancestors from 500 or 1,000 years ago? However, DNA testing is a very, very useful tool, but we always use it in combination with other records. And we can use it in a number of different ways, but the important thing about DNA testing is on its own, it doesn't tell you anything. It's when it's used in a database and you're being matched with other people in the database. And that is where the power of the testing comes from. It's the combination of DNA with genealogical records and with large databases. So what you can do is you can hope that you will have a match with someone, say a second cousin, who has got family photographs, who's done more research on their family tree than you, and that will help you with your family history research. It can help to confirm the research that you've already done, so if you have a match with a second cousin, at least you know that your research on that line is correct. You can compare two people with the same surname and see if they have a match. So there are all sorts of different hypotheses that you can test about relationships using DNA testing. And as the databases have got larger and larger and larger, it means that the chances of success are now much, much greater.
I started off, first of all, doing genealogy, and it was my husband, after my husband's father passed away, that I got involved in genealogy research because we inherited a number of family photographs and we couldn't identify the people in the photographs. So I then started to write to family members to try and work out who all these people were, and that gradually sucked me into family history research. And then having done that, and having done some research on my husband's family tree, I decided to research my own family tree, and I've got a very unusual maiden name, Cruise, C-R-U-W-Y-S, which It's very rare, and the family story was that we came from this parish called Cruise Morchard in North Devon, and they were lords of the manor, and I was trying to prove that I was connected to this family that lived in the manor house at Cruise Morchard. And so my family history research then focused very much on this one particular surname. I joined the Guild of One Name Studies and ended up doing a one name study of the Cruise surname, and a number of my fellow members of the Guild of One Name Studies had already started doing Y-DNA projects, and Chris Pomeroy was one of the very early people who was using Y-DNA testing, having started a project back in the year 2000. I went to one of his talks and then decided to set up my own project for the Cruise surname. So that's how I got started in it all.
So what this means is that there are different types of DNA tests that we can take, that we can use for our family history research. And the first test is the Y chromosome DNA test, and this was, back in the year 2000, this was the first type of test that was introduced. Now, as we saw, only males have a Y chromosome, so you have to be a male to take this test, or if you're a female, you have to find a male relative with your surname of interest to take the test on your behalf. Now, the advantage of the Y chromosome is that it doesn't go through this recombination process. It's passed on intact from the father to his son. So this test can actually tell you about your recent ancestry, but it can also go back for thousands and thousands of years. Second test is the mitochondrial DNA test, and this follows the all-female line, both males and, I forgot to mention mitochondrial DNA. That's a little sort of circular structure in the cell, and both men and women have this, and it's passed on intact from the mother to all of her children, but only the females will pass it on to the next generation. So this traces this all-female line. And then the third type of test is the autosomal DNA test, which looks at those 22 recombining chromosomes, and this gives you a representation of your ancestry on all of your family lines. But for family history research, it's best used for looking at connections within about the last 5 or 6 generations.
So it's actually quite satisfying if you have a match with, say, a second cousin or a fourth cousin, and you then know that your paper trail research is correct, and you've got that additional evidence that your paper trail is correct. And also it can sometimes lead to new discoveries. And I've actually been surprised at how many people have got unexpected results from autosomal DNA tests, and all the family secrets that are now starting to come out. And that in itself, I think, is creating all sorts of new ethical challenges.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned the size of the databases, so that Ancestry is over 7 million at the minute.
10 million now.
Oh, is it got?
Yep.
Every time I look, it's bigger.
Yeah.
23andMe is up to 5 or 6.
5 million, yes.
I mean, that's a massive expansion over an 18-month period, really, from maybe last year, maybe early last year. And as you've kind of hinted at, there are consequences of that expansion. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about that. Has it felt to you, working in the field, that there's a sudden explosion in this?
I would say in the last year, and that in 2017, more people tested in 2017 alone than in any previous years.
That's just sensational, isn't it?
Yeah. And there was a time, and certainly when I started, we had to explain DNA testing and how it worked, and really encourage people to test. Now, because it's being advertised on TV, it's expanding beyond the genealogy market. So previously it was just hardcore genealogists who were doing the testing, especially the Y-DNA testing. Now people are testing, and it's a younger demographic, and it's people are doing it just out of curiosity. They see the advertising and they think that the DNA test will tell them who they are. So I think there's a lot of confusion with the new people testing, and they don't understand what the results mean. But it is also driving new people to start doing genealogy research.
And is there a concern amongst the genealogical community that you get essentially what are lots and lots of bits of information which don't then have any context? You know, I test for my, I'm 22 and I buy an ancestry kit, or I get it for my birthday or whatever, have it done, and then I'm just my data's just left without anything around it. I don't fill in the rest of the detail and stuff.
Well, a lot of genealogists tend to be quite dismissive of this new breed of tester who just comes in and takes a test and looks at the percentages and then doesn't do anything more with it. So the genealogists are very dismissive of all those so-called ethnicity percentages, because we know, if you've done your family tree, you know that if you've got 10% Iberian or 10% Italian that comes up in your ethnicity report, that it's completely meaningless. But the people who haven't done that research do tend to take those sort of things quite seriously and think that it does actually mean something.
And are you concerned? I mean, do you think that's a kind of slightly worrying thing, that people might, for instance, get given a test as a gift, take it, and then assume that these things are correct?
Yes, it is quite worrying. I've had people writing to me I had one lady who wrote to me who was really concerned because she came out at 25% Irish, and she'd done her family tree and she didn't have any Irish ancestors, and she really thought there was some sort of problem with her research and that somebody in her family hadn't told her a big family secret. So I had to write back and explain to her that she shouldn't take those results seriously. Her family tree was perfectly correct.
Wow, there's a kind of that it can put that doubt in your mind.
Yes.
On the other hand, are there people in your experience for whom this kind of test has confirmed something or has opened up something which they hadn't necessarily anticipated?
Well, I've come across a number of people where it's uncovered something they hadn't anticipated, and that's particularly the case with Jewish DNA, which can be detected with good confidence with these tests. So if someone comes out with 50% Jewish ancestry, then that means usually they've got a Jewish parent. And I've come across a couple of people one person, first of all, he didn't accept the result, and he was actually referred to me by another organisation. And I had to sort of explain to him that this means that although your family tree shows that all your ancestors from England, you do actually have one Jewish. It's most likely you've got a Jewish parent, and it turned out it probably was his father. And he then actually was quite accepting of it and embraced his new Jewish heritage. And he was an actor, and he'd actually sort of was seeking out roles that reflected this Jewish ancestry.
Oh, really? Oh, how
yes.
So our final guest for this first episode is Erin Battat, who is a researcher who's worked with Ancestry.com on a number of research projects. And it's a really nice insight to listen to her as she describes the ways in which the algorithms are built and the research is put together to allow genetic genealogy to do the really cool, smart, interesting stuff it does.
Absolutely, and what I really like about Erin's work is that she's an historian, so she's coming from a particular point of view. She's interested in kind of ways in which this stuff integrates with history. So she's got a very interesting perspective on how we might understand Ancestry's work, particularly in this area.
My role at Ancestry.com was to explain the migration patterns of groups of customers who shared common ancestry. So Ancestry Dna would use both customers' genetic data and family tree information that they submitted to identify clusters of people who shared common ancestry. You might think of these as micro-ethnic groups. So, for example, groups of people who lived in a remote region of Ireland. And they would use the genetic and family tree information to generate maps that showed the migration patterns of these ancestors over time. And I would analyze the maps and tell a story about what life was like for these people prior to migration, why they left, and what they experienced at their destinations. My task was to figure out the broad settlement patterns of a wide range of ethnic groups, mainly in the United States and in Australia. And so first I would look at historical maps and even recent maps to figure out why these particular groups emerged in relative genetic isolation. And this was usually due to geography. So I figured out the geographic contours of the places where these ancestors were born in order to understand why they developed in genetic isolation. And then I turned to the vast literature on the settlement of the United States during the colonial period and westward expansion and the slave trade, as well as micro-histories of particular ethnic groups, such as the Welsh in Pennsylvania or Sicilians in New York. I also turned to census data to locate some of these groups socioeconomically. So Ancestry gave me lists of the most common surnames in these groups, and sometimes I could use those surnames to find out common occupations from the census data, or to find out a particular ethnic or religious background that could be indicated by their surnames. Sometimes really fascinating and unique stories would emerge from this research. One of the first groups that I studied was a group of people in Southwestern Ireland. And I noticed from the maps that there was a concentration of people with shared ancestry in a very tightly bounded region in a boggy area of Western Ireland. And when I looked into this particular region, I learned that it was a hideaway for rebels and outlaws who were fighting against the British, stemming back from the 16th century. And so that became a really exciting story to tell and to explain why this particular group of people developed in relative genetic isolation.
The next episode of this series is based primarily in Australia, and we'll be talking to some amazing family historians and some amazing scholars about the consequences of DNA and genetic genealogy for a sense of kinship, for family structures. We're going to talk about ethics, we're going to talk about revelation, and broadly we're going to talk about bigamy.